Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second installment of our webinar series on California's property tax structure. My name is Rob Gutierrez, President of the California Taxpayers Association, and I'm excited to introduce today's panel of speakers. Today, we are 21 days out from the election, and already more than 279,000 Californians have cast their ballot in what could be a deciding vote to reshape California's property tax landscape. I'm chairing the Proposition 15 Opposition Campaign Committee with Alan Zarenberg, Rob Lapsley, and Rex Hine. If you have not yet engaged with the opposition, it's not too late. Funding remains critical, and we all need all the help that we can get. If you'd like more on that, please contact me at rob@caltax.org. Last week, we heard from David Ardor about how market value assessments prior to Proposition 13 lead to lack of uniform assessments and uncertainty, and what things were like before Proposition 13. Brianne Rabowski discussed the evolution of Proposition 13 over the last 40 years, and Ben Lee provided an overview of Caltax's analysis of Proposition 15 and the proposed changes to California's assessment system. Today, we'd like to dive further and discuss these changes in more detail and unpack the meaning of what these changes could actually result in. Proposition 15 is one of the most poorly drafted ballot measures that we've seen in a long time, and it's riddled with errors, lack of clarity, and leaves much to the legislature to interpret. Before we get into the drafting issues, former Director of Finance, Tom Campbell, will discuss the economic impact of Prop 15. Caltax hired Tom late last year to analyze and study the economic impact and work in coordination with Bill Ham, who published an economic study on the impacts of the initiative. Tom is currently a professor of law at Chapman University. So with that, let me introduce you to two of our panelists that are joining us today, Craig Becker and Eric Miethke. Craig Becker is partner at Pillsbury Law in their Silicon Valley and San Francisco office. He resolves tax controversies and counsels taxpayers on property tax issues. Craig handles property tax valuation and Proposition 13 change in ownership issues. Craig represents taxpayers in audits and resolves tax disputes through litigation, assessment appeals, and proceedings before the State Board of Equalization and local assessment appeals boards. Eric Miethke is the president and CEO of Capital Law and Policy, which he founded in 2018 after spending 25 years as a partner at Nielsen Merksmer. He's also the former legal counsel for former Board of Equalization member Ernie Dronenberg, and as a registered lobbyist, he's able to work on strategy, integrate legislative, regulatory, and initiative referendum elements for his clients. Eric is one of the premier tax policy advisors in California, and that's why the No on Prop 15 campaign hired him to analyze the legal impacts of Prop 15. So he'll share some of the drafting flaws that he's been working on. My colleague Ben Lee, Caltax's in-house tax counsel, will moderate the discussion and make sure that we're respecting everyone's time. As a reminder, CPE credit is available for this webinar, and an application for MCLE credit is pending approval from the State Bar. We will be contacting attendees with credit information at the conclusion of the webinar, and to ensure compliance with the accreditation requirements, we have a few polls during the hour to make sure that you're all following along at home. And with that, we'll turn things over to Tom Campbell.
Thank you, Rob. I'm very happy to have been asked to talk a little bit about the economic consequences of increasing property tax on commercial and industrial property, which is what's on the ballot that's being discussed in Prop 15. The most important step to analyze first is what will this do to the employment. If you increase taxes on employers, will it diminish employment? The answer is yes, absolutely. That's a 100% certain effect. What's the dimension? The legislative analyst, which is nonpartisan part of the government, has come up with a rough estimate. I've studied all of the economic studies, really all of them over the last 20 years on the effect of the property tax, and the Berkeley Research Group in a study done by Dr. William Ham, who was himself a former legislative analyst, has informed my conclusions. I am a former Department of Finance director, and I am a professor of economics as well as a professor of law at Chapman University. I was dean of the business school at UC Berkeley, the Haas School of Business, and I have my PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. The best estimates that we can come up with are that the increase in taxes on employers, those who create jobs in California, will be a 75% one-time increase in property tax. And then every year thereafter, a higher increase. Because what Prop 15 does is to increase the assessed value all at once. 75% increase in real property tax is going to cost about 120,000 jobs. Now, there will be an increase in state government jobs and the other agencies of state and local government and full board government, where the public sector will grow a little bit. But the best estimates that the Berkeley Research Group came up with, 120,000 lost jobs in the private sector, and no more than 60,000 won back in the public sector. Another way of looking at this is the overall employment in the state of California will drop by 1.65%. So those are some of the benchmarks that we have to accept as the economic effect of increasing taxes on commercial and industrial property. And when you apply an increase in tax to commercial or industrial property, you're going to have the effect passed on to consumers, particularly where there is no opportunity to go elsewhere. So think about a hairstylist, think about a service being provided in a shopping center. As the property tax goes up, those affected companies, those affected employers will not only have to lay off some workers, that would be 0.6 up in employment, but also pass along some of that increase in cost. So the groups that are going to be hurt are going to include consumers and workers. The folks who advocate this change never say that. They try to convey the notion that the cost will be borne by some amorphous big business, that this is somehow not going to hurt consumer or hurt employment. Economically, that's nonsensical. When you have a 75% increase in property tax, you will lose business. Now, this comes on the heels of California having lost businesses quite readily. The Spectrum Relocation Consulting Group has carefully estimated the flow and before the COVID-19 shutdown, 2018, 2019, California was losing about 300 companies per year. That's the effect that we can anticipate from this 75% increase in real property tax for businesses, layoffs, increased price for consumers in 1 year, and then subsequently higher real estate taxes going forward. When I was finance director of California, one of my privileges was to speak to manufacturing groups, industrial companies, commercial enterprises, urging them to come to California. So I've now just spoken about companies leaving California because of the tax increase. The economic studies are unambiguous on this, that there is an even greater effect on deterring companies from coming into a state. So thinking about California's future, coming out of this COVID-19 virus, which God willing will be soon, but still coming out with a weakened economy, we will not be on the engine of recovery by bringing in new businesses to California to the extent we could otherwise. And a good way of looking at this is the judgment that companies make before they go into a state or a location within a state. For every year there is a survey of companies that move, and the survey analyzes tax increases upon this decision to move. The survey is done by the Area Development Annual Journal. And what they have come up with is that the attractiveness of a state or location within it is negatively affected by an increase in property taxes, and that this is recorded story after story of companies deciding where they're going to locate, and specifically not locate in California. The best comparison, I think, is just to ask, how would a company considering moving business into California assess the tax situation? We have the National Tax Foundation, a well-respected data gathering and analyzing foundation, which provides us with data for such a comparison. And the clearest one, I think, we all know stories of companies that have left us and moved to Texas. Before I give you the statistics, I'll just say I was a congressman for 5 terms, represented Silicon Valley, and one of the most remarkable things was to see the research development arm for silicon chips go to Austin, Texas, rather than stay in Silicon Valley. So that consortium, it's called Sematech, left California, even though the chip makers were all at that time headquartered in California. We were still making chips. They created their joint research program. They went off. So what's the comparison? Well, according to the National Tax Foundation, the state of California is number 6, the very top of all 50 states, 6, including income tax, state and local taxes, property taxes, gasoline tax. Weighing those all by their appropriate weight in the economy, California's number 6. The state of Texas is 46. So you see at the start we're in a race where our principal competitor is far ahead of us. But the one thing we have going for us is our relatively modest real estate tax, number 20. Still in the top 20 of all 50 states in terms of real property tax on business and real property individuals as well. The number 20 compares with Texas, which is number 13. So we have one big argument and one big comparative advantage that I was able to emphasize when I was finance director in California. And that was this: if you come to California and build a plant, you're going to pour concrete and ink caissons and in construction, you can be assured that your property tax bill is going to be protected by Prop 13. The whole country knows Prop 13. The whole country, if you ask individuals, would have Prop 13. We do. We have it. So I would say go build your plant in Texas, and you might get a favorable assessment going in. But there's no protection against the assessment going up to 3-4% next year. In California, you have the guarantee of property. I'm telling you, that was a huge argument. It was the best argument I had asking companies to come. I want to conclude by saying that I understand the arguments on the other side. Let me say that this idea has been around since Prop 13. The opponents of Prop 13 have never rest. Opponents of big government are constantly looking to undo Prop 13. This idea was being advanced when I was a state senator. It was being advanced, and that was in the 90s. So it was being advanced in the 80s when I was a professor at Stanford. I was a U.S. congressman. Been around 30 years or more. Nevertheless, the side advocating this increase in taxes, emphasizing that there's a sudden need for more revenue because of the impact of the COVID virus. I understand, and I do want to point out that they would argue for getting this tax increase no matter what, but their premise now is because of the risk of the virus. I understand that argument, and I have an alternative. The reason for the alternative is that it makes very little sense to try to fill a one-time hole in the budget with a policy that will substantially deter our ability to grow our economy and derive revenue from the natural growth of the economy. We lose businesses. So the alternative would be we are at an all-time low in interest rates. So a far wiser solution would be to go to the people, not with this tax increase, but with a proposal for a bond. Bond the amount that you need for the $53 billion, if that's the correct number, and we will pay interest on it at historically low level. The federal 20-year Treasury note now is 0.6%. This is phenomenal. It's almost, well, in Europe, as you know, some countries are actually at negative interest rates. If you buy a bond, you pay the government a little bit instead of getting a little bit from the government. So it's not that I have no alternative. We have a very realistic alternative. Don't destroy our ability to recuperate from this crisis by increasing property taxes in California. It will kill our ability to recuperate economically. It will cost us jobs, and it will increase prices. If you have an emergency need, then go to the people with an emergency solution. This is not an emergency solution. This is a long hoped for undermining of property, and it is not to the interests of the people of California. Thanks again for this opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you to Tom for talking to us today. Unfortunately, he did have some technological issues when we were recording, and so we apologize for that. And so, like Rob mentioned earlier, this is our first polling question today, just to make sure everyone is still awake. Great. And with that, we'll move on to our discussion with our esteemed panelists, Eric and Craig, and their interpretations of some of the more, I guess, confusing provisions in Proposition 15. And so, Eric and Craig, take it away.
Thank you, Ben. I think the first thing to start with is just to work on something Professor Campbell said, which is we're throwing this very high tax at a struggling economy. And I think the amount of incremental revenue that we'll see is going to be severely less than what's being projected. But even beyond that, the first thing you run into when you read the proposition and you work your way through it, which is a challenge, is just the massive amount of cost it's going to take to get this thing off the ground, and part of the poor drafting in that cost. So the first thing that happens is, before we even get $1 to help the fiscal causes that the proponents are trying to promote, we have to fund all of the assessor and AAB costs to make this work. And those costs are going to be substantial. And the first thing you see in reading the proposal is the costs that are going to be funded are not very well defined. It's defined as all the costs necessary to implement fair market value assessments under 2.5. Well, that could be potentially the entire commercial property division of the assessor's offices. Unclear. So that number could be huge. The other thing is it's also going to be funding an assessor's office that's going to be struggling to get staffed up. Assessor's offices are going to need possibly 2 or more times the number of commercial appraisers they have now, maybe even more. Commercial appraisers are already in short supply, and those costs are going to be incredibly high. And then we're going to have really increased demand on AAB hearings. Counties right now have, maybe in the smaller counties, one AAB that meets maybe once a month. Other counties have a couple of boards. The number of boards and the number of people that are going to be dedicated to doing AAB hearings is going to go way up, along with counsel costs going way up. And on top of that, the provision provides that this cost has to get funded before even incremental revenue comes in the door. So as it is now, the 2022 effective date of this provision, we wouldn't see incremental revenue at all until fiscal year 2022, and probably not any substantial incremental revenue till we get deeper into the phase in. So a struggling budget is going to have to fund these massive costs without incremental revenue going in. And that's not just assessor administrative costs. There's costs to funding the lost income tax revenues. There's costs to funding the enhanced personal property exemption that Eric's going to talk about. In fact, those costs are so large, I think, Eric, you told me 21 of the 58 counties
think that they won't even have positive revenue from split roll. So it's a challenge on what it's going to take to fund this proposition. The next thing we come to talk about are implementation challenges. And the first thing you run into on implementation challenges is just how people get taxed initially. The thing starts in 2022. It has a phase-in of 3 or more years, so it could be 24, 25, or later before it's completely phased in. And you're going to have this uncertainty of when, if you're a commercial property, when do you first get your new reassessment? The way the tax law reads is you pay a higher reassessment for the first fiscal year when the county assessor completes your reassessment. Now that's an interesting set of wordings, because how does that affect you? So you're sitting there on 2022. Let's say you're a commercial, you own a $10 million, let's say you own a $20 million mall property that has a $20 million mall property, and you're sitting there wondering when and if I might get reassessed. Well, if you get through the beginning of this to the enrollment date for July 1, 2022, and you haven't been reassessed, you may think, I can be comfortable that I'm not going to get reassessed in the first year. Well, not so really, because the way it's worded, you are subject to tax for the first fiscal year when the assessor completes the reassessment. For that 2022 year, the assessor could complete that reassessment, at least in my reading of it, aggressively, as late as deep into June of 2023. So if you're a mall operator and you have triple net tenants, you could be sitting there not expecting a reassessment till, well into 2023, June of 2023, and then you would probably get 2 reassessments, the 2022-2023 assessment and the 2023-2024 assessment. And not only do you have trouble figuring out how you're going to pay that, you're going to have trouble figuring out how you're going to pass that surprise onto your tenants. You've been sitting there operating with the idea that the reassessment would be delayed to you, but now you have this bill that you have to pass on to your tenants. And then you also have the further challenge: if you don't like the value, how are you going to appeal it? You have a very short time period in which to file an appeal. And the way the new appeal rules work, you're going to have to file an appeal with all sorts of documentation proving that assessment is wrong. So again, I think, to follow up on Professor Campbell's presentation, the mechanics of how this works and how it will hit normal people and normal operations and the uncertainty of it is going to be really, 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 really extreme. And the next level of uncertainty I know Eric wants to talk about is, even after we get through this difficult initial implementation, we're not even sure how the cycling process of reassessments will look. I think there's some uncertainty there.
Is that my cue?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it, Eric.
Hi, everybody. Hope you're enjoying the pandemic as much as I am. And I want to talk a little bit about other issues that are going to arise after initial implementation due to, I think, faulty drafting, not thinking this all through very well. A little bit of background to sort of set the stage for this. As we know, under current law, your annual property tax assessment is the lower of one of 2 things. It's the lower of trended base year value or the fair market value of that property on the lien date. That's the so-called Prop 8 adjustment. Under Prop 15, if it passes, it's not quite so clear how this is all going to work out, because Section 6 of the initiative says that the full cash value of commercial industrial real property is its fair market value on the lien date. And subdivision B of that same section, though, that says that after this phase-in period that Craig was talking about, then property will be reassessed, commercial industrial property be reassessed no less frequently than every 3 years. Going back to the phase-in period, there's a provision, I think Craig may have mentioned, that there's a provision in there that says that until your time comes up and you are reassessed, you are not liable for property taxes the increased property taxes prior to that date. So let's say if it's a 3-year phase-in, it becomes effective in 2022, you come up for assessment for the first time in 2025, the initiative says you're not going to be held liable for those taxes in 22 and 23 and 24. That's all well and good. There's no such equivalent statement that says that, of course, though, when full phase-in has occurred. So with that as backdrop, here's the issue. So assume that after the phase-in, the legislature says the property is going to be reassessed by the assessor every 3 years. Well, what happens if you're assessed then in year 1, and then 3 years go by before you're reassessed again? And if assume in the intervening 2 years, the market goes up and the value on the lien date in year 1 after the reassessment is higher than it was the last time the assessor came around. Well, when the assessor comes in that 3rd year to reassess you, does that mean you get escape assessments for year 1 and year 2? Or does it only mean that when the assessor comes in to reassess in year 3, that's your new assessment until he comes around again? And it's sort of like a bad Hobson's choice, the way you look at it. Because let's say the market went up, like I said. If you say that the initiative says what it says, and the fair market value is the value on the lien date, and that is self-executing, then it would seem to be that when the assessor comes in, he's sort of compelled by the Constitution then to not only reassess for that year 3, but then to issue escapes if he can establish on the lien date that the value was higher than the value than he had put on the property the last time he or she came around. So, and that's buttressed by the fact that you have this language in the phase-in period that says you're not liable during the phase-in period for taxes that accrue that would go up prior to when the assessor comes in to reassess. It's not there for the full phase-in period. So that sort of suggests that that's an outcome that could happen. Well, let's assume then, let's go the other way. Let's assume the legislature realizing how popular that's going to be. And you can imagine, Craig mentioned, a shopping center. Just imagine landlords having to chase tenants for retroactive taxes long after a lease is expired and they've already gone. So let's assume that the legislature wakes up and says, hey, that's not going to be a big seller. So let's do something different. Let's say that the assessment that you're going to be taxed on is the value that the assessor puts on it when they come periodically. And that's what value stays throughout that whole interim period until he or she comes around to reassess again. Well, then what happens if in those intervening year 1 and year 2, the market falls? If the market falls, then you should be theoretically entitled to, under current law, you'd be able to get a lower value. In this case, however, if the triggering event is the actual physical assessment by the assessor, you're going to be paying taxes on a value that isn't there. It's lower. That if fair market value is lower than the assessed value from the last assessment, and that means taxpayers are going to be overpaying tax in a falling market. So, the way I sum this up is you have your choice of either retroactive escape assessments or no Prop 8 adjustments, take your pick. It's kind of a lousy combination, but again, I think it's because it was poor drafting, because it wasn't really drafted by people who knew a lot about property tax. So again, what about suing for a refund? Well, in that falling market scenario that I posited, if it was the first scenario where the triggering event is just actually what is the fair market value on every lien date, yeah, you probably could get a refund. Under that second scenario where the triggering event is when the assessor comes in to physically reassess periodically, probably not. Perhaps an unintended consequences, but that's one of the ones that the proponents of Prop 15 aren't talking about. So that's it. Back to you, Craig.
Well, so then the next slide, please, Ben. The next thing you run into is part of the process that was used to, I guess, sell Prop 15 to small business. And when you carefully look through these provisions that were intending to make this thing palatable to small business, you see it just, again, workability problems abound. The first thing you see is this $3 million property exclusion, which starts off saying that if a property is worth less than $3 million, it won't be affected by Prop 13. And you immediately see all sorts of challenges with this. The first challenge is that what does a $3 million per property value have to do with appropriately marking small businesses? Oftentimes, small businesses don't own property. They're tenants. They have pass-through issues. So you start off looking at this with a little askew about what it's really trying to target. And then the next thing you come to is, how is the $3 million fair market value determined? Well, the statute carefully points out that this will be determined by the assessor and only appealable absent abuse of discretion. So the $3 million is going to be a number you're just going to have to live with, whatever the assessor says your property's worth, probably. The next thing you see is even more disturbing, which says that in determining the $3 million limit, we look to all the direct and indirect owners of a property, and we accumulate all the properties that they have any ownership interest in. So if a property has a multiple owners, or if an owner owns other property at all, it all gets accumulated. I mean, a real simple example would be if you had two sole doctors practicing, they own their own clinic, it happens to be worth $2 million. If one of those doctors happens to have an investment in a nearby commercial property that is in total worth more than $1 million, the properties all get combined and both sets of properties fail to qualify for the $3 million. So this tiering and combining of the $3 million in the limit makes the limit pretty narrow and almost non-existent. And then finally, what makes it difficult to work with is the limit is a statewide limit. I honestly don't know how assessors will be able to practically administer claims for this exclusion when they need to be able, if they're going to test it or audit it, to have a statewide property database to look at. Eventually, it may require some massive database that allows all the assessors to connect and coordinate, which would be another expense that would delay and also take down the incremental revenues further. The next small business provision that you see that's also challenging is a small business provision for allowing a landlord to temporarily keep his Prop 13 benefits if he has more than 50% small business tenants in his property. Now we start with the fact that this is only temporary. So this is to go away after the implementation process is completed. It goes away in 2025. The legislature could extend it, but it's nothing that's permanent. Small business is defined in an interesting way. You have to have less than 50 employees. Your business cannot be any sort of business that has sort of any managerial or common control from outside forces, which would seem to exclude franchisees and chain stores, people who have franchisee arrangements. And then finally, it requires a really odd comment that it requires the small business to own California real property, which strikes me as really strange, because if you're trying to promote tenants and small business tenancies in a landlord, why would you have to have a requirement of ownership of real property? The challenges of making this work are also difficult. And it's also going to be interesting to make both of these provisions work when you consider the fact that there's a very stiff claim filing requirement to make it work. You have to comply with all the legislatively required claim filing requirements. The claims have to be timely filed, and they're subject to audit. And when I'm looking at this, if I'm a landlord and I've got a tenancy, I've got a property that's filled with small businesses that qualify, and I'm looking at going through this expense during the implementation process, I'm sort of looking at claim filing lottery, right? It might be the case that I don't even get Prop 13 reassessed until I get to the end of this process when this benefit, so-called benefit, isn't even available. But if I don't file those claims now in advance, it may be that my claim may be deemed inappropriate and not timely filed. So I can see just, again, all sorts of challenges in making these things work. First of all, the $3 million exclusion just isn't going to be available to many people once you do all the tracing. And the landlord exclusion, I think, has very, very stiff requirements for qualifying small businesses.
Okay, let me comment first about a couple things Craig said. First of all, I want to make it really clear that with regard to the general real property part of Prop 15, there is no small business exclusion. There is a low value exclusion. If property is valued at under $3 million, it doesn't matter who's operating on the property. Apple Computer could be operating on a property that they're leasing from somebody that's a $200,000 property. It's not subject to reassessment simply because a large business is operating on it. So we need to be real clear about that. There is no small business exclusion from Prop 15 as it relates to realty. So with that in mind, a couple of things to sort of flesh out on this. There's really only two mentions of small business in Prop 15. And one is, as Craig mentioned, if you have over 50% of the floor space, rentable floor space, square footage of your leased premises occupied by a, quote, small business as defined in the initiative, then you get this sort of stay of execution, this sort of delay to, what is it, 2025, I believe, 25, 26 lien date. The other thing that you get if you are a small business as defined is you get a complete exclusion or exemption of your business personal property. I'm going to come to an interesting possibility with that. And again, another drafting error. So those are the only two real things in the initiative that uses the term small business. The $3 million thing is a low value property exclusion. It is not a small business exclusion. Craig mentioned what's a small business as defined in the proposition. Fewer than 50 full-time employees. There's this independently owned and operated requirement such that the business ownership interests, management, and operations are not subject to control, restriction, modification, or limitation by an outside source, individual, or another business. Boy, that's a mouthful. And then the third criteria is they have to own real property in California. So, I mean, Craig kind of mentioned the first thing, which is if you're an assessor, how do you even audit these criteria? I mean, you're going to get different interpretations by different assessors all over the state, particularly the second one, this independently owned and operated thing. So, you know, a few things that perhaps the proponents didn't think about when they came up with this is, first of all, this employee requirement. You get a complete exemption if you have 50 or fewer, and you only get a $500,000 exemption if you have more than 50. So what do you do if you have 51 employees? You lay somebody off. Or worse still, it's a constant incentive, long-term incentive in the law to substitute machinery for people, right? If you can reduce the number of people you have and replace them with machinery, then that's a good thing. That augurs towards a complete exemption from your personal property tax. And depending on how much personal property you have, that could be a goal worth achieving. Some issues arise on this independently owned and operator thing. Craig mentioned that, you know, your average, that seems to take out your average little Subway franchise holder, since they're probably pretty heavily regulated by the corporate entity from whom they received the franchise. But it could be even more subtle than that. So what about a restrictive bank covenant that says if the business fails, if there's a standby right to come in and operate the business, does that vitiate this whole concept of independence? We don't know. There's a lot of these things that are going to pop up if this thing passes, where that's going to be front and center in terms of implementation problems. So finally, there's this third requirement that to be defined as a small business, curiously, the small business has to own real property. Well, if the whole idea was to delay implementation on the rental side, on the leased property side, that seems kind of odd, but like, again, that's just one of the many odd things about this initiative. But they sort of made, I think, a pretty critical error, which is they've said that the property ownership has to be of California real property. And for those of you who are attorneys and you smell a Commerce Clause issue lurking here, of course, that's the case. So in other words, if you met all the other criteria and you owned real property in Arizona, you don't qualify. You own real property in California, you do qualify. Well, that seems to be a Cutler versus Franchise Tax Board problem. Marty, I'm talking to you, so let's just bear that in mind. What would happen if that one provision were struck down? The initiative does contain a severability provision. So chances are that that criteria might be stricken, which might be a handy thing, because I think the statistic I saw was 78% of California small businesses don't own real property. So something to think about. But there's good news where in the midst of all this trouble, there is potentially some good news. Again, a potential drafting error turning into a business opportunity. So Section 7 of the initiative adds this new part to the Constitution that says, for a taxpayer who is a small business, all tangible personal property owned and used for business purposes is exempt from taxation. Okay, that's a critical phrase, owned and used for business purposes. Probably was a drafting error, they didn't think it through, but I don't see a requirement that the owner of the property also be the user for business purposes to get the complete exemption. So for those of you in the planning business, you can hopefully start sending me royalty checks if this all comes together. But there seems to be a real business opportunity here for a new cottage industry, the mom and pop, heavy equipment leasing business. Because if you have less than 50 employees and you're independent and you own real estate and you could work it out of your own house and put that in the company's name, then it would seem that as long as that property that you're leasing out is being used for business purposes, that would seem to qualify for the complete exemption. Now, you might ask, doesn't Revenue Tax Code Section 405 allow the assessor to assess the personal property to either the owner or the lessee? Doesn't that defeat that? Well, at least at first blush, 405B seems to limit the assessor's discretion to do this to situations where there is taxable property. So in the hands of the lessor, the property is exempt. So it isn't clear to me that that isn't even an option to defeat this planning strategy. So if Prop 15 passes, maybe, there's some good news. Maybe it'll spawn a whole new cottage industry of mom and pop heavy equipment leasing. Unfortunately, airplanes and vessels are excluded. Darn it. So we can't get everything, but it's something to think about.
Hey, Eric, any thoughts on the affiliation rules that the legislature is able to frame up for this? Will that be a problematic possibility of narrowing this, or how do you see that playing out?
Well, I think the clear intent is that if you have if you're a conglomerate and you have multiple subsidiaries, you basically get one $500,000 exemption. You don't get to divide the property up and start creating multiple subsidiaries and having them own property under 500, up to the $500,000 limit. So I understand from a anti-abuse standpoint why that's in there. But I also think the legislature will interpret that affiliation rules as broadly as they can to narrow the exemption as much as they can.
So that on top of that common interest, that broadly drafted common interest and control provision could make this a less than acceptable broad limit the application.
Well, I think it says every business is going to get a $500,000 exemption. So, I mean, whether that means anything to a high-tech company or to an oil company, probably not.
And that's a statewide 500,000?
Yeah, and that's again a problem in that if you have multiple business locations, there's no guidance in there on how that $500,000 gets allocated of exemption gets allocated amongst the counties. But if this passes, there'll have to be an implementation committee like there was post Prop 13, and those will be one of the problems that gets tossed into the hopper to get figured out before implementation occurs. And by the way, the implementation on the business personal property tax side doesn't occur until
2024.
2024. So it's, they want to suck up 2 years of real property taxes before anybody gets a break here. So we got plenty of time to worry about implementation issues on the PIT side or on the personal property tax side.
The next thing is just the definitions of what is the protected residential property, what is the protected agricultural property, and I'll just start off with residential property. Of course, the crown jewel here, the thing that we absolutely do not want to get into to hopefully get to entice voters to vote for is we want to make sure your home is safe. Well, the interesting thing is that protected residential property is defined as real property used as residential property and the land on which those structures are placed. Well, that's kind of an interesting scope of the protected residential property that will always get Prop 13 protection. I guess the first question that comes up, what about vacant property? What about vacant homes? What about people with vacant vacation homes in California? What about an apartment complex that has a wing that's vacant and being renovated? Is it possible that those could be considered not to being under use of residential property? You wouldn't think so, but it's certainly that focus on use seems to leave that open. The other thing is, what about vacant land surrounding a home? My customary bike ride every Saturday out of San Mateo is through Woodside. Well, lots of those homes in Woodside have lots of ground around them. I suppose if they're on a minimum sized residential lot, they're probably protected. But if there's other vacant lots around them that aren't being used for residential property, unclear whether that would continue to get Prop 13 protection. The next thing you see in here is that the legislature is able to define what's an acceptable limited use for a home office, a home business, or short-term rentals. So the legislature is charged with defining that. We hope they do a good job with that, but that's also kind of an interesting issue given what we've all been living through the last 6 or 7 months. I can't think of one room in my house that I haven't been working in at one time or another. So how those definitions will interact with what becomes protected and not protected. And then finally, I think one thing that Eric will talk on and touch on as well is, we oftentimes see, at least, in my neighborhood, a suburban neighborhood, you occasionally see a home be converted into an office, a doctor's office, or a realtor's office. And then oftentimes you sometimes see it converted back into residential use. What will happen when properties go back and forth across this line and sometimes meet these tough definitions of getting Prop 13 protection and sometimes don't? Will they return to the old Prop 13 numbers, or will we have new assessments? And I think all of that continues to play out even in a bigger way for the agricultural properties, which I know Eric has spent a lot of time thinking about.
Yes, indeed.
Before we jump into the agricultural definition and kind of those issues, this is our second poll question. All right, Eric, you can take it away.
All right. Hang on, let me close the poll questions. There we go. Agriculture. We could spend an hour talking about ag. There's been a lot of focus in the media. Let's just try to hit the high points because I'm a little concerned about time and want to leave time for questions. So excluded from the provisions of Prop 13 is property that is, it says specifically, real property used for commercial agricultural production as defined in this section. That definition in this section means land that is used for producing commercial agricultural commodities. So immediately when I saw this, I said, well, I don't know whether it's intended or unintended, but land has a very distinct meaning in the property tax world. Land is defined in the code. Land is, the big definitions are land and improvements, and which include fixtures as part of the definition of improvements. And then there's personal property as a residual definition. So these words have consequences. So in the ag world, only the physical dirt is what is excluded from Prop 13. Prop 15. All of the improvements, dairy barns, packing sheds, you name it, any improvement to the land, which includes, by the way, orchards and vineyards, once they pass the age after planting that entitles them to a constitutional exemption. Once they pass that age, which is I think 4 years and 3 years respectively, could have that backwards, but then those become improvements to land and those become taxable as well. The proponents are just plain deceptive and evasive, and they say, oh, it was never our intent to do that. Look at the intent language. I don't care what the intent language is. The law is pretty clear. If the wording of the ballot proposition, if the wording of the constitutional amendment, like a statute, is clear, the intent doesn't matter. I mean, they can intent themselves forever, and it just doesn't matter. Ag improvements under Prop 15 will be reassessed at fair market value, and that's all there is to it. So I wanted to touch on that because that is something where there's been a lot of upheaval in the media. You know, there's a lot of issues such as, well, it says that there's a definition of commercial industrial real property that includes vacant land not used, again, for commercial agricultural purposes. So that begs the question, what happens if you're letting land lie fallow and not using it because you're letting the land rest for a year, or if it's grazing land and you're not grazing animals on it for that year in order to allow the vegetation to recover? Is that still being actively used or not? Because if it's not, and it's vacant land not zoned residential, then it's swept up into the definition of commercial and industrial property and reassessed. So that's going to be a big issue. There is there are questions about Williamson Act. I don't think it completely voids the Williamson Act, because Williamson Act is actually in the Constitution, which allows the legislature to allow for special treatment of open space. So I don't think it phases it out. But one thing it certainly does do is it creates an incentive for local governments who theoretically will be trying to maximize revenue, and can do so by changing the zoning and by getting out of either not renewing or, where possible, canceling Williamson Act contracts. There's a huge incentive to do it. And if you think about it too, the other sort of big driver here in the ag business is going to be just, again, those incentives. For years, we talked about this problem of fiscalization of land use, where government was approving retail facilities and auto malls because it generated sales tax. Well, now, if something is being used for agriculture, it's not generating any new revenue. But if you're phasing it out and rezoning things to be commercial industrial and discouraging agricultural use wherever possible, then of course it does turn into revenue for the local government. So the long-term megatrend, if this passes, again, is going to be putting pressure on minimization and gradual elimination of ag property, which can't be good for California. So I think, rather than get bogged down, if there's specific questions that come up in Q&A, I'd rather deal with them there, because I'm just conscious of our time. So back to you, Craig, on problems with residential assistance.
Well, just back to the next slide, just to follow up on Eric's comment on disincentives, the disincentives also extend to housing. I mean, this has been portrayed as being something that's going to help housing. I don't know that I see that. I see more disincentives. I mean, housing has already been somewhat challenging for developers to get approval for, because one of the things Eric said is it's not a property that produces sales tax revenue or a property that produces revenue. Well, now it becomes a property that will have Prop 13 protected assessments, whereas commercial properties won't. So the difference there is going to create yet another disincentive for housing, the way we have a divergent property tax structure. I think that's problematic and an unintended side effect. One of the biggest unintended side effects, one of the large unintended side effects that we've seen over time too in analyzing this, is that California over the years has put a fair number of important important incentives into the base year value structure. So the way the Prop 13 base year value structure works now for commercial property is you get a base year value upon a change in ownership, a new base year value upon a change in ownership, or upon new construction when you build something. Well, over the years, there have been a fair number of new construction exclusions developed that keep your base year value from growing when you do certain things to your property, and in that way provide incentives for certain positive things to be done to the property. So Prop 13 currently now has a seismic new construction exclusion, an ADA new construction exclusion, a life safety new construction exclusion, and just a general overall definition of new construction that encourages people to do maintenance and improvements to their properties without creating assessments. All of that will be sliced away once base year values go away and commercial properties don't get protections for base year values anymore. Along with jettisoning that process, the new construction exclusions and the new construction additive or exclusionary process just goes away because property gets reassessed every lien date or every cycle of reassessment. And so that seismic value gets picked up, that ADA value gets picked up, all of these things get picked up, creating, diminishing what had been a very carefully calculated and drafted incentive for building owners to improve their properties and provided needed improvements that help us all. And I know Eric wants to talk a little bit about the last item on this list, solar.
Yeah, so this whole phenomenon, this screw up on the part of the proponents and missing this impact of Prop 15 on the definition of things excluded in the Constitution from the term new construction. Yeah, that was kind of an early thing that I saw, and we shared this with some industries, and the solar industry responded by getting legislation passed, which is SB 364, in which the legislature said, okay, we're going to take these active solar plants and we're going to declare them to be tangible personal property, and no longer will they be an improvement to realty. That passed, and let's assume for a moment that that is constitutional. We won't get into the constitutional issues today, but let's assume it is constitutional. There's a couple things that are of note for those of you who are going to be practicing in this area. One of those is that the exemption stays in place for these plants built prior to 2025. It stays in place until there's a change in ownership. Well, interestingly, the language that the legislature picked up for change of ownership is the same existing change of ownership structure that exists today. So in other words, the very quote unquote loophole in the change of ownership laws that the proponents complained about, they've now baked into this very same piece of legislation. So again, practitioners note, if you're a Sharpie and can structure these deals so that you're transferring less than majority, 50% ownership in a corporate entity to any one of a number of entities that would then hold these active solar plants, you can create, in essence, a permanent exemption. So I thought it was kind of fun that the proponents who were scrambling politically to try to cover this defect in Prop 15 ended up falling into the same loophole that they were complaining about in the first place. The second item on this is just sort of again, an eye on the ball type of thing. What happens if there is a change of ownership of an active solar plant after this bill becomes active? And it becomes active, incidentally, only if Prop 15 passes, so let's keep our fingers crossed. Let's say that there is a change of ownership. What happens then? Does the active solar plant go on to the secured role or the unsecured role? Well, if it's been declared tangible personal property, at least presumptively, it would be headed for the unsecured role. The assessors may have some discretion on that, but to the degree it's on the unsecured role, there are consequences to that. The primary one is that 100% of the property tax on the unsecured roll is due in one installment in August. You do not get the 2 installments in December and April or March or wherever it is that you get under current law for the secured roll. So there is a small rate difference too, because the rate on the unsecured roll is last year's secured roll rate, but those are usually fairly minor. But the third consequence of this to keep your eye on is actually on the sales tax side. So there was no doubt when these were improvements to realty that these active solar plants, the construction of them were construction contracts under Regulation 1521. Clear affixation to realty, clear consistent treatment between the real property and the sales tax law. So that if you were involved in one of these contracts, you were the consumer of all materials used in the project, and there was no tax on the actual construction contract. You were only the retailer of tangible personal property, machinery, and equipment under Regulation 1521. Query, now that this no longer is deemed to be real property, no longer an improvement to realty, that it is deemed to be personal property, whether that opens the possibility, this asymmetric treatment that that someone could claim, hey, that construction contractor now becomes a retailer of all of everything that they sell to the ultimate consumer. And so they would buy all the materials for resale and collect tax on their entire construction contract. The bad side of that is all the fabrication labor and assembly charges would become subject to tax. It's true, separately stated installation, not so. But it could have some pretty significant sales tax consequences. So not saying it's going to happen, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. If this thing passes, to don't just assume that everything's going to be the same and unsettled on the sales tax side of these contracts. That's it.
So our last slide was just talking about the new appeals rules, and the new appeals rules, I think, also have some sweeping effect because they seem to indicate they would be applicable to all assessments under 2.5, all fair market value assessments. So you would think it's possible they could be extended to all commercial real property assessments, not just the reassessments generated as a result of the implementation of split roll. And there's some pretty hard things here. First of all, there's the repeal of the 2-year rule. So the 1604C 2-year rule requiring hearings to be heard within 2 years goes away. There is no burden of proof burden on the assessor. So currently when there's escape assessments or supplemental assessments or something other than a purchase price assessment, the burden of proof shift, that goes away. A real significant one is the new evidence requirement. They specify that your appeal has to include evidentiary requirements demonstrating the support for your valuation opinion. That's going to be interesting, just how quickly you sometimes have to file an appeal, sometimes 60 days after getting an assessment. And then the last one, judicial review. I know, Eric, you wanted to talk a little bit about that. It seems like the judicial review standard, which is no surprise, but it seems like it's now baked into the Constitution.
Well, as followers of Caltax have known, one of the things we fought for years, unfortunately unsuccessfully, was trial de novo in the courts. Currently, state assessed properties do have trial de novo by statute, and locally assessed properties do not. I think we had crossed the threshold, though, where the legislature no longer thought that it was just, they had no constitutional authority to pass such a rule. This, however, would in essence permanently, and at least until the Constitution would be amended after Prop 15 were to pass, this would apparently, the way I read it, prohibit the legislature from ever passing a trial de novo statute for judicial review of local real property assessments and assessment appeals. So I don't know why they stuck all these things in here. Maybe I think they may have been sweeteners to try to get the assessors to come on board. It could be the other way, is to try to keep the assessors from freaking out about, oh my God, we're going to get flooded with a flood of new appeals as a result of this new split roll thing. And this was an attempt maybe to accelerate that process of assessment appeals simply by removing any rights that taxpayers have, and therefore making judgment against the taxpayer a lot quicker. But at any rate, it's something to be aware of.
All right, well, I think we might be all out of time, so we might have to just jump to Q&A. We have one more poll, though, before we do that. And so while everyone is answering, oh, there we go. And so if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A or the chat function. It looks like we have already gotten a couple of questions in here. And so the first question that we got was, is it clear that assisted living is not excluded as residential property and will be reassessed under Prop 15?
Do I take that, Craig, or do you want me to take
it? I see a little note that this is Rob's baby. And Rob, you're on mute right now, so if you're gonna.
I think Rob just.
Does he want us to answer it live as opposed to typing the answer? I mean, I've been asked this question, so I can say a little bit about it.
Sure.
Or I'm unclear. Ben, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to respond to it, or is Rob going to handle it privately?
I think if you guys are comfortable with answering this question live, feel free.
Sure. Well, in looking at this, it's not clear. And the reason is that you've got on the one hand a provision that says business and commercial property is reassessed, and then you've got residential property that isn't. Well, there's hybrids, of course. Hotels are a good example. There's no indication that the proponents had a goal to make hotels not subject to reassessment. So clearly that's a situation where it's sort of residential in nature, but it's still going to be subject to reassessment. So going over to something like assisted living, I think you've got a combination of the provision of a residence, but also with the provision of services. And depending on the degree of intervention and the nature of the legal relationship between the service provider and the residence provider and the tenant / patient, you could get different answers. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, in law, we've generally cut the baby on these things at 30 days. In other words, if you are leasing somebody a residential property for under 30 days, it's subject to transient occupancy tax. If it's a lease over 30 days, it's like I'm leasing an apartment month to month, not subject to transient occupancy tax. So, I mean, the first question would be, what's the relationship between the assisted living landowner and the actual tenant? Is it more like a landlord-tenant, or is it more like where there's no clear lease of the property or of the residence? It's more like a license, like a hotel does. You have a license to use it, but you don't have an actual estate in land. And then as you travel up the spectrum more towards a skilled nursing facility where there's a combination of, sure, there's a place to live, but also there's more and more interventional medical services, that inquiry could shift very much depending on facts and circumstances. But this is going to be a great example of one of those things that if this passes, that it's going to have to go to some sort of implementation effort on the part of the legislature to clear up exactly how it does apply to assisted living, because you could come out a whole bunch of different ways on it.
Great, thanks for that answer. The next question that we got was, if Proposition 15 does pass in November, might there be constitutional issues that will have to be litigated and that could possibly delay the implementation of Proposition?
Well, I think there's certainly loads of constitutional issues in this provision. I mean, probably the biggest one is just the implementation process of having comparable businesses treated unfairly in the process of implementation and treated unequally under a standard assessment standard. So could that delay the implementation of the Prop 15 provisions? It seems to me unlikely that it could delay the implementation. I don't know. I'm curious what your thoughts are, Eric.
Yeah, the only thing that could really delay implementation would be something ballot related, something election related, like single subject or something like that. I don't really see anything. I mean, this is just me. I'm not an election lawyer. I'm a tax geek, but you know, unless there's something there like that, I think we're looking at implementation. If that's the specific question, and as Craig points out, I agree. There's tons of issues that are going to come up, like I mentioned, just like on the small business exemption, this idea of requirement of owning California property, that's got to get litigated.
Yeah, definitely. The next question that we got was, what do you think is the strongest argument in support of Proposition 15, and how do you counter?
Well, I'll jump in. I think their strongest argument is just they say that somehow this imposes a better standard of fairness, that somehow it's more fair if commercial property is valued at fair market value each year. And I think the counter to that, in my view, is valuation standards are so subjective. It is so difficult to value property. And that what I think you're really looking for in an efficient and well-run tax system is objectivity, clarity, and ease of administration. And Prop 13, I think, delivers on all of those extremely well for something as difficult as measuring property value. And I think that's the answer, is we have something that's objective, it works, it's efficiently administered, and this system that we're going to try to get to some sort of truth and justice with true values every year is just going to leave all of that behind. And I think it's just an overly optimistic view at trying to get to something that's this fairness concept.
Yeah, and for me, it's hard to distinguish an argument for Prop 15 per se. I mean, there's lots of things that you could say that we should re-examine in terms of the property tax system in California, not the least of which is that we're spending 50% of our resources on the personal property tax when it generates 6% of the revenue statewide. That makes no sense in this day and age. So to me, there's lots of things about the property tax that is the subject of some conversation. But this proposition is so poorly written, even if you wanted to say we want to tax business properties different than the rest of the roll, it's so filled up with bad drafting that it's hard for me to marshal an argument in favor of this proposition. So I guess I'm a little bit stumped to come up with something other than, even with all the inefficiencies and all the rake-offs, the money that's going to go to the general fund, the money that's going to this is going to shift money out of poor rural counties in the middle of the state and shift money into urban areas. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are bad about this, but at the end of the day, it generates money, and if you think that that's a positive thing for government, that government can spend money better than the private sector, I suppose you think that that's an argument in support of that. I just don't happen to subscribe to that.
Sure. The next question that we got was, if I convert my retail property to condos, would Proposition 15 apply? And would I have to do it by January 1st, 2022?
Well, I think once property is converted to residential, and you've converted it to residential and used it as residential, you would think you'd get the benefits of Prop 13, regardless of when you converted. I suppose the interesting question there is, if you convert after split roll is passed, where are you? I don't know that you'd get the benefit of your legacy Prop 13 number if you converted after split roll was passed, because your number would be elevated due to the retail property reassessment that happened to occur after split roll. I think you might get it going forward, but I think the conversion of split roll would take away your legacy value.
Great, and we might have time for one more. I know this is a question that we kind of got to last week, but so will golf courses go to a highest and best use standard under Proposition 15 and no longer be protected under Proposition 15 if it passes?
Yeah, I can answer that very quickly. They will be reassessed. My belief is that there's an overwhelming chance that they will be reassessed, but I think the constitutional provision that says they will be reassessed as a golf course and not as at their highest and best use, I think that continues. So depending on what golf course property is worth in 2022, as opposed to whenever it was last reassessed, there may be an increase. But if that golf course is now in urban Western Los Angeles, and again, that exemption apply, or that treatment applies, it's a nonprofit ownership, it's over 10 acres and has been there since, over 2 years, then I don't think it gets highest and best use treatment. I think we can do this last one too, Ben, if you like.
Sure. So the last question that we had was, to avoid all these problems, why didn't they consider just raising the commercial rate to 2% instead of 1%?
Well, one reason why, and first of all, I have no idea what their considerations were. I'm not privy to the proponents' mental development on this. But I will say that if you double the rate, that changes that left them with a predicament that I could see. If you double the rate, that is going to fall on state assessed properties. So in other words, that would fall on the gas and electric companies, which means that it's going to raise their property taxes, which means then it goes into rate base, and which means people's electricity and gas rates go up. And you could see the commercials that they would be facing on that. And consequently, if they say, well, we'll just exclude that, we'll exclude the big, the state assessed utilities from that rate increase, then the commercials read, gives a tax break to major utilities and taxes your local business. So my suspicion is if I were trying to pick up a reason why they didn't do that politically, that would be it. But I know Larry Stone's a big fan of this particular concept of doubling the rate. So you can talk to him about his ideas about it too.
Sure. And with that, thank you, Craig and Eric, for joining us, and for all of our attendees for joining us for the second episode of our webinar. Please tune in next week for the third episode in our series, where we will do an even deeper dive into the initiative, talking about some of the requirements that the legislature, the State Board of Equalization will have to implement in order to actually make this proposition work. And so join us at the same time next Tuesday at noon, and we hope to see you all there.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.